Well, we've got yet another great guest to help us learn more about Christian history on our This Week in Christian History podcast. And today we are talking with Dr. Scott Keith, who is the executive director at 1517. We'll learn more about what 1517 is as we truck on in our conversation. But we are using today's deep dive to talk about the death date, April 19th. 1560 of Philip Melanchthon or Melanchthon or Melanchthon, depending on where you are and which way you want to throw it out there. So a man known by various syllables, but somebody that's not hard to pronounce is Scott Keith. So Dr. Keith, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. Well, we want to learn a little bit more about Philip and about him and about his impact on, particularly, I guess, the German Protestant Reformation. And is it fair to say that he's the Robin to Luther's Batman, or is that
No,
oversimplifying it?
it's maybe oversimplifying it a little bit, but it makes it relatable and understandable to people, the relationship between them. I mean, I could really nerd out on you in DC Comics and say maybe it's more like the Nightwing to Batman, but
Okay.
that's fine. You know, he definitely was a counterpart of Luther, a colleague of Luther at the University of Wittenberg. It's fair to say that he brought some things to the Lutheran Reformation that would have been absent, save he hadn't been there with Luther. It was an interesting relationship that from the time that they met was lifelong, especially for Luther. Luther dies in 1546, and made that early Lutheran Protestant Reformation what it was, especially when where Melanchthon's concerned in the courts and to the princes, which is something that Luther was not able to do, mostly because of circumstances.
Sure, sure. So tell me about so how did they meet is a great question in my brain, but then also give us a little just of his, kind of his biographical background. How did he get there? He was a student of Luther's, right?
No, he was not a student of Luther's.
Right.
Let me say it this way. If he was a student of Luther's, Luther was a student of his also. And there's a
Gotcha.
real particular way. So Melanchthon is born in 1497. He dies, you said, in 1560. He's younger than Luther. Luther's born in 1483. And so he's younger than Luther by 14 years. And so you also see that where Luther dies about 15 years before him. So they have a very similar lifespan. He's just younger than Luther. Melanchthon is a child prodigy in what we would today, I think, just call the humanities.
Hmm.
He was a philologist by training. He was an expert in languages, particularly even from a very early age, Latin and Greek. In fact, his born name is Philip Schwarzerd, which is German for Black Earth. He's given the name Melanchthon, which is Greek, meaning Black Earth, and he's given that by his great uncle Reuchlin, who's a famous linguist and humanist. Kind of think of if you've heard the name Desiderius Erasmus, who was a
Sure.
famous Greek scholar at the time. Melanchthon's great uncle Reuchlin is sort of famous in the same light as one of the only Hebrew scholars of his time. Also was very good in Greek and Latin as well. And for the people listening, you need to know that one of the early things that makes the early Reformation possible is this idea of the return to the sources from what we call the humanists of the time, where they begin to learn the classics, Aristotle, Plato, Homer, Cicero, and they learn the classics by relearning the languages. So they become experts in Latin and Greek initially, and eventually through people who have to go study with Jewish scholars, they're reluctant to teach them Hebrew as well. This is Melanchthon's bread and butter. And he's a child prodigy in this area. I mean, he gets a bachelor's degree by 1512. Again, he's born in 1497. So by 15 years old, he's got a bachelor's degree from the University of Heidelberg, where he studies philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy, astrology, Latin, and Greek, and is a top student at the university. By 1516, he has a master's degree from the University of Tübingen. So again, he's born in 1497. So by 19, he has a master's degree there. At Tübingen, he studies philosophy, Latin, Greek, classical literature, law, medicine, mathematics, and a budding field of study that you might be interested in that he really initiates as a modern field of study, and that's history. So he's one of the first people to sort of try to bring formal methodologies to the study of history in the Renaissance and Reformation. After he receives his master's degree from the University of Tübingen, he's at this point known as one of the greatest Greek scholars in the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, at 19 years old, he publishes a Greek grammar that is used to teach Greek in German universities for over 100 years. This is how good he is. So how he and Luther meet is Melanchthon is called to be a professor of Greek at the University of Wittenberg, where Luther is a professor of theology.
Or Luther's already there.
He's already there. He's already a doctor of theology. This is 1519, so the big 1517 year, where Luther has written the 95 Theses and posted them on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg has happened 2 years ago. Luther is famous by this point. The only reason Melanchthon goes to this backwater university, which was very much a backwater university, he really wanted to receive a call to the University of Tübingen or the University of Heidelberg, both of which he would have had opportunities at. But his great uncle Reuchlin encouraged him to take the call to Wittenberg, specifically because Luther was there. So that's how they meet. Melanchthon meets Luther. He's captivated by Luther. Is he a student? Not formally, but Luther has a great influence on him theologically. So much so that Melanchthon wants to teach theology. So he and Luther approach the elector and say, hey, can Melanchthon teach theology? The elector says, no, man, he's called here to teach Greek. He's got to stick to Greek. Melanchthon says, that's awesome. I will teach Greek to all these students, and they will learn Greek by reading the book of John in Greek.
Oh, wow.
And so then he gets to start teaching theology by virtue of the fact that if you're teaching students to read the book of the Gospel of John in Greek, you're going to be teaching theology too. And so that's kind of how that rolls there. They work together very closely early on. In fact, Luther attributes his translation of the Bible from initially the New Testament from Greek into a vernacular German, which Luther and the people that helped him translate kind of had to invent that vernacular written German in order to do that. Attributes his ability to do that from Melanchthon helping him to learn Greek well enough that he could do it. He called Philip Melanchthon his master when it was concerned there. And in fact, Luther by that time had been studying some Hebrew, and in return begins to teach Melanchthon Hebrew. But within 2 weeks, Luther writes a letter to one of his good friends saying, this little master, even though I have been his teacher of Hebrew, has within 2 weeks surpassed me and is now teaching me. So he's a prodigy at the end of the day, specifically in this area of what we might call linguistics, language.
Wow. So he's found that sweet spot, right? Or he's understanding his calling and all of that. But he's not a priest, though, is he?
No, he's never ordained in, not even after sort of the Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation would have stopped calling their pastors priests or ordaining them as priests. They would have attempted to call and ordain them as pastors. But not even at that point is he ever receive an official call to a church. Now, within Lutheranism, after the writing of the Augsburg Confession in 1530, the emphasis very much goes to being rightly called over ordained, and so the connection of being a pastor is to the local congregation more so. So Luther is a pastor, a priest in the early evangelical Protestant churches, but he serves a particular congregation. He serves the Castle Church in Wittenberg. Melanchthon's a professor, and he is called to be a professor. They would have had other categories that we don't really have, including a call as a theologian. We have that in universities, but such a thing might have even existed within a church at the time too. So it's hard to call him a layman. People often call him a layman. It's hard to call him a layman, um, but he was not a parish pastor in the same way that Luther served the castle church.
Right. Okay. Well, but just because, and please correct me, don't, one of the things that I enjoy about doing these deep dives is I'm the guy that's learning as much as anybody else. So it's helpful for me about part of that. But Luther didn't always have this kind of a relationship with every person that was, let's just call it quote unquote, on the faculty together, right? Or that
No,
they had the seminary work. I mean, he wasn't always the easiest guy to get along with, right? So
no.
the fact that it must have been, and I'm making a huge assumption here, but it must have been that Luther obviously understands pretty easy early on. This guy knows exactly what he's talking about. He believes the same things that I'm believing. He understands what reform is all about, and his scholarship and his ability are recognized. And I maybe have a respect for him in that, in such
Yeah.
a way
Oh,
that
that's for
grows into
sure.
a friendship, right? Is
Yeah,
that
that's for
be
sure.
fair? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, he's in a lot of ways beyond somebody like Justice Jonas, who was he's a lesser known figure. He's sometimes called the great translator of the Lutheran Reformation because he took a lot of the stuff that these guys would write in Latin and translate it into German and publish it so that everybody could read it. And it's fair to say that Jonas was probably Luther's best friend, if you kind of want to use that category on the friend side. But Melanchthon was an equal as a colleague in many ways. Melanchthon's sort of earliest well-known theological work is something called the Loci Communis Theologici. And that's just Latin for the common topics of theology. It's the first Protestant. In your world, you'd probably call it a systematic theology. In our world, we don't use that terminology as much. We call it a dogmatic. Same thing, right? Topical theology,
Mm-hmm.
going from this topic
Right.
to that topic to this topic to that topic. Melanchthon publishes this in 1521, and it's published based on a series of lectures that he gave in Greek on the Book of Romans. Okay, and it is initially his students write down the lecture notes and they publish it without his permission, and he gets upset, and so he cleans it up and he publishes it in 1521. If nobody's read that, there's two translations of it. One is in the Library of Christian Classics. The other one is published by Concordia Publishing House. I'd recommend either one if you want to get a sense of how early Protestants, quote unquote, did theology. It's the best example you'll ever find, and it's just a 1521 Loci Communis is what it'll be published under,
Okay.
and it's excellent. One of the things that students of theology will automatically know is that he does not start with a typical topic. He does not go from God to creation to sin. He actually just starts like the Book of Romans does with sin, right? And then jumps in, and you eventually end up at the capstone, which is justification, chapter 4 of the Book of Romans, justification, and you go from there as the sort of the center point. I always call it the Loci Communis is a race to Christ, right?
Yeah.
And he does that. Now Luther reads this and he writes a letter to one of his good friends and he says, I am, just to your point, he says, I am rough and boisterous. I go around and I'm pulling up thorns and thistles and making a mess everywhere. And Master Philip comes behind me and he makes neat furrows and plants seeds as God has so aptly prepared him to do. And he says, I would not correct this master of theology, even though I am a doctor of theology and surpass even the great Johann Eck in all my titles. And what he's written here is so good that it should be considered for canonization. In other words, he says, the Loci Communis is so good, we ought to make it one of the books of the Bible.
Mm,
And so that's his respect for Melanchthon.
how about that?
Melanchthon, in return, has a lot of respect for Luther. They never really get into a public row, which is odd for Luther, and even in later life, odd for Melanchthon. Um, Melanchthon does have some areas that he oftentimes laments Luther's rough and boisterous nature, which is and there's times when you can find where Luther says, "Hey, I wish you'd be more bold." Right. So, but if you've ever had a friendship with somebody that's a little more gregarious than you, or you are the more gregarious one and you have a good friend who's a little more humble, you know that that is the tension in the relationship with that. Like the humble person always wishes that their sort of loud, obnoxious friend would quiet down a little bit, and the loud, obnoxious friend always wishes that the humble person would just make more assertions. And
Yeah.
that's sort of how it went for them too.
Isn't that fantastic? Hey, we're talking with Dr. Scott Keith, who is the executive director of 1517, and we are enjoying our conversation about Melanchthon and Luther, and about how that unfurled, particularly, and grew during the Protestant Reformation. So, did Melanchthon go outside of sticking with his kind of core thing of being a professor and being able to be a teacher like that? Did he move into the structure of setting up churches and understanding more about the development of the Protestant church itself, particularly in Germany?
So it's kind of interesting because these guys are earlier than sort of if you're Reformed or if you're Baptist, this is an earlier movement. So we're talking 15 teens, through the sort of the Melanchthon dies in 1516, but the capstone of this for Lutheran Reformation is 1517, 77, 1580 with the publishing of the Book of Concord, right? So this is sort of like a 60-year 1520 to 1580 kind of movement that we're
Right.
talking about, which is pretty early Reformation if you're in one of sort of the non-Lutheran Reformed-ish groups. So the answer is yes. I mean, early on, they do something called the visitation of the churches in the 1520s. So again, that's really early, where they're sending theologians from the University of Wittenberg out to parishes to see what the pastors know, what the people know, what the kids know. And out of those visitations, you get a lot of things. You get Melanchthon publishing the articles of visitation saying, hey, this is what should happen in these churches. You get Luther publishing his famous small catechism. You get the initiation of grammar schools in a lot of these cities for the education of young boys and, surprisingly enough, for the time, young girls. This grammar school curriculum Melanchthon develops. You get the development of a more unified curriculum at the various universities within Albertine and Ernestine, Saxony, and then even down to Greater Germany for the time, all of which Melanchthon develops these university curriculums. In fact, I often say if people want to know why they should know the name Melanchthon and they've gone to a university that's not a UK university, but it's in sort of the Western sort of university tradition, you should know it because Melanchthon developed that curriculum. In fact,
Wow.
the grammar school curriculum that we used to call grammar school was developed based on Melanchthon's gymnasium curriculum that he developed for Lutheran kind of public schools in Germany. And so, yeah, I mean, as far as the development of schools and churches, the University of Wittenberg became a hub from which pastors would be sent to local congregations because you have to remember this is so early that prior to them, the only mechanism for sending pastors or priests to places would have been the episcopacy of the Roman Catholic Church. And so once that wasn't the case, they had to kind of figure out what do we do now?
Right.
In fact, Melanchthon writes one of our Lutheran confessions called On the Power and Primacy of the Pope, which deals directly with the fact, how do we ordain now that you guys have cut off ordination to us? And so he deals with that. Um, his sort of greatest work as a churchman would probably be the publishing of the great Protestant Confession of Faith, the original Protestant Confession of Faith in 1530 called the Augsburg Confession or the Confessio Augustana, in which he writes and is presented to the emperor at the Diet of Augsburg on June 25th, 1530. And then once the Roman Catholics get that confession and they write the response to it, he publishes a defense of the Augsburg Confession, just called the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, published in 1531. Those two things are in our Lutheran Book of Concord. They are official Lutheran confessions of faith. And various other reformers sign on to the Augsburg Confession or versions of the Augsburg Confession, even non-Lutheran reformers do, and it's still widely known as sort of the original Protestant confession of faith against the Roman Catholic errors of the time. And Melanchthon's the author for that, not Luther.
About that. So he's he's understanding as well, I guess, whether just by necessity or because, you know, they had a good huddle and it got put on the whiteboard, one way or the other. Hey, look, we don't have a 3-ring binder to really show us exactly how we're going to do this. And so
Yeah,
we got to have something to pull from, which needs to be scripture, obviously, if we believe
right.
and understand that that's where it is. And who better is going to understand the church than somebody that understands Greek and understands really what those things would say. And so here's kind of the way we ought to do it.
Yeah.
A part of that fits into the greater development of the church, not just teaching other pastors and theologians and others about what they're preaching. Is that
Right. So, I mean, if Melanchthon's Loci Communias was used as the textbook to train pastors for 150 years in German universities. He wrote postils, which were sample sermons, which were used by sort of lay preachers within local congregations within Saxony and what we now know as Germany for a very long time. If you were a pastor that wanted to learn Greek so you could study the New Testament in Greek, you were probably using his grammar to learn Greek to study the New Testament in Greek. If you were going to be considered an evangelisch church, which we now call Lutheran church, of that time, you would have had to sign on to the confession that he wrote that was called the Augsburg Confession. I mean, it just goes deep, deep, deep. If you were a student of theology at the University of Wittenberg between 1519 and 1560, you would have had Melanchthon for at least 4 classes, maybe
wow?
5. You maybe lived in his house and you maybe studied theology over the dinner table at his house, just like you would have maybe lived at Luther's house if you were there while Luther was alive. They both operated, the equivalent of dormitory boarding houses for students from the University of Wittenberg to stay. They both had table talks where they would teach theology and language and rhetoric and philosophy over the dinner table. They both had sold out classes and lectures every day. Um, I mean, it would have been an amazing time to be, to witness.
No doubt, no doubt. What a fantastic thing. And I'm glad we took this opportunity to remind ourselves if we already knew something about him, or maybe learn something about him in a way that we might not have known otherwise, which is kind of the reason we do this whole podcast thing. How about that? And do our other add on to that we call Christian History Chronicles as well to do. So Dr. Scott Keith, thank you so much. Tell us about 1517. Tell us what your organization is and how we can learn more about what you do.
Yeah, 1517's mission is to declare and defend the good news that you're forgiven and free on account of Christ alone. And we do that by providing various free online and in-person, well, the in-person resources aren't free. You're going to have to pay a registration fee to come to a conference. But through the website, which is just 1517.org, just the numbers, 1517.org, it's about as simple a web address as you can find. You'll go on there and you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of articles that have been written over the last 10 years that are easily searchable on any topic or any Bible verse. You could type in, John 3:16 and see how many of our articles over the course of the last 10 years have referenced that. You could type in sin and you'd get, probably 50 articles that deal with the doctrine of sin. You could type in an event in history, the death of Martin Luther or the death of John Calvin or life of John Calvin, and you'll get, many, many articles. We have a podcast network with over 20 podcasts on it. Some very, very popular shows within the world of sort of Christian podcasting, including one of the ones I'm on called Thinking Fellows. We have some that deal directly with just going through the Bible, 30 minutes in the New Testament, 40 minutes in the Old Testament. Those can be found on any podcast network. We have free academies that are taught by some of the most qualified professors in the world on their subject of study that you can reach by clicking the video link on the website. We have resources for pastors under called the Craft of Preaching page, which is helping pastors to do their, accomplish their weekly preaching tasks to the best of their ability to the glory of God. You can check that all out at 1517.org. We have 2 annual conferences, one in Bentonville, Arkansas, one in San Diego, Southern California, every year, where we get just awesome speakers to come and go through various topics. This year's main conference topic is called The Bondage of the Will, following after the anniversary of Luther's Bondage of the Will, which was published in 1525.
How about that? You guys are busy. Thanks for
Yeah, we're busy.
well, we're just glad that we got snuck in there a little bit for you to be able
Yeah.
to talk about this subject. So thank you again for joining us and for sharing some great insight.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anytime I get the opportunity to teach people about Melanchthon, I try to take it.
Okay, well
So there you go.
that makes sense why the dots got connected. So that's
Yeah.
that's good on our end. Fantastic. Thank you.